Hello there, my name is Laith and I was in the EU5 announcement trailer, one of the coolest things I've ever done. Europa Universalis 5 has been described by some as the most complicated game of all time, and so I'm here to make things simple for you. Whether you're a complete beginner to strategy games or a veteran of the series, this guide is going to tell you everything you need to know to get cracking and start experiencing the game for yourself. Now this video is a long one, so let me explain the format first. Here are the timestamps of the main categories I'm going to be focusing on. In my opinion, these are the core areas of the game that you need to know. I had debated putting other ones in here, but realistically no one is clicking on a 3.5-hour tutorial, and so here we are. These are the most important ones. Each category is going to be broken down into topics. You can navigate those using the timeline at the bottom of your screen. This video took me a while to make, so if you are considering getting EU5, it would be much appreciated if you used my link down in the comments below and used code HELPLATE, that is case sensitive, and I get a small cut. Otherwise, if you already have the game, then make sure to subscribe because EU5 content is going to be coming out very regularly from now on. Alright, it's time for us to dive in. Okay, so you've just booted up your first game of Europa Universalis 5 and you're presented with this. Lots of different tabs, lots of different flags, control groups, and more map modes than you'll ever see in your life. Today we are going to be breaking down all of the different aspects of Europa Universalis 5, and we're going to start from the very basics. So if you've never played the game before, if you've never played any grand strategy game before, I'll take you through it. If you're a little bit more experienced, you'll still need to be taken through it. This is a very different game to one you might expect. Now I will be showing you what each of these buttons mean, what all of these different numbers mean, and what you can do with them in due course. But first, before we get to anything like that, we need to discuss population. That's because whereas games like, for example, Europa Universalis 4 had things like mana, you had these diplomacy, admin, and military PowerPoints, here we have population. It's a lot more of a systemic game, this. Everything sort of flows into each other. What does that mean? Well, we have 5.473 million people in Castile, and if I select the population map mode down here, or I search for it, we have this population map mode, which the more I zoom in, you can start to see where people live in these different locations. The best way to get your head around things in Europa Universalis 5 are to think of it in real terms, for the most part. The more people you have, the more money your nation will make because you are going to be more economically productive, the more troops you can field. Equally, if you lose a battle, let's say I raise all of these 50,000 people as levies and I lose them all in a battle, well that's 50,000 people that are not going to be coming back. Right at the start of the game we have the Black Death, and well, let's just say not many of us are going to survive that. But zooming all the way in, you can see that we have lots of different locations. A group of locations is called a province. So let's have a look at Toledo, the city of Toledo. We have 78,000 people living in Toledo. They stratify into these different classes. We have nobles, clergy, burghers, laborers, soldiers, and the rest are peasants. These are your different classes that will form your estates. We'll get more onto estates later, but just know that your peasants can become any of these provided there is a need for them. If I do this and build a bunch of tools guild, well that's going to increase the demand for burghers, and so 1,000 of these guys, or in this case 400 of them, are going to promote to fill that gap. This is called population promotion, the speed of which is determined by a lot of different factors, but just know that we have this idea that you have this population that is quite dynamic in how things go. They can join in at different social classes, and also if I go up here, select this and go over to the pops, they all have different needs. I'll go more into this later on, but if I hover over this middle one here, you can see that the different access of goods they have. There are 85,000 Castilian peasants in Sevilla, for example, down at the bottom of the screen. And here are the things they need, and here are the things they are lacking. In the trade section, we'll go over exactly how to get all this stuff by importing. But for now, the basic concept is if your population needs are met, they are going to be happy with you. If they aren't, they're going to be, well, not happy. Over here, we can see population satisfaction. Don't get too bogged down with all the numbers, especially if you're new. Just try and get it into your head that you want to satisfy your people. Happy people means a productive people. Unhappy means they're going to start rebelling. All right, now I'm going to take you on a guided tour of the user interface of Europa Universalis 5, the UI. Up at the top left, we have our king. Over there, we have our nation's flag, our nation rank. At the top, we have our estates. It's not immediately clear. I'm not 100% of a fan of the UI, it has to be said. But this is what this means. The little bar at the bottom is how satisfied they are. Red means under 50%, green means they're over, and then the monthly change is going to be shown by that number. All of this stuff you can hover over, and the key part is there are nested tooltips, which means if I want to find out what, for example, an estate enrichment is, I can hover over it. Oh, what's an estate? Oh, it's this. What's a country? What is diplomacy? What are diplomats? What are societal values? What's cabinet? Okay, so you kind of get the idea. Over here we have our money, our ducats. That's how rich we are. If we ever have a negative here at the end of the month, then we will take loans to satisfy it. Too many loans, you go bankrupt. We have stability. This is from a scale of -100 to +100. Best way to think about it is higher stability, people are happy. You've got that pop promotion speed coming in here, and estate satisfaction is going to be higher. Low stability, more people are likely to join rebel groups, and general problems are going to find you. Legitimacy should be thought of in a similar way. Both the legitimacy and stability you want as high as possible. You have your prestige, which has these effects here. Up here we have 5 diplomats. This can be weird because you'll have 4.7 of a diplomat, but what that generally means is that you need at least 1 diplomat to go and do something. Let's say I was going to go declare war on Aragon immediately, then I would need a diplomat to do so. But things such as building a spy network are going to require a maintenance of diplomats. Then we have war exhaustion, our manpower, and our sailors. Now this manpower for professional troops, this is not your levies, same thing for the sailors. Up in the top right, we have our speed and the date. We have what age it is here, and then we come onto this side of the screen here. This is the outliner. This is customizable. You can have what you want to be tagged onto this. For example, I don't care if rebels are sieging, therefore I don't want it pinned here. You can also hide the outliner if you so choose. Moving on, we have the ledger. This is going to show you all the information that you know about the current world. For example, if I were to sort by the amount of pops, the most populous nation that we can see is the Sultanate of Delhi and the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. All the way over here, we have Yuan, China. That is obviously going to have more people, but we can't see it, therefore it doesn't show up. Then we have the finder. Let's say I wanted to find where Toledo was because of an event or something like that. It's simple as that. This can also stretch to nations as well. For example, the nation of Aachen is over here. We have the Europedia. Let's say you want to know about what trade capacity is. Select all pages, trade capacity, and there it is. It's good for like definitions of things, but it's not exactly the most descriptive. For example, I've just typed in trade capacity. You're not going to know what that is. This will give you a general idea, but it's not going to teach you how to do it. Then we have automation, which I'll get to later. The hints page, which will tell you generally what's going wrong in your country and things that you can do to change it. For example, we have low legitimacy. What does that do? And here are the recommended actions. This is actually quite a useful thing for you to keep an eye on if you are a newer player. But as you can see here, sometimes it's a little bit off. For example, we're getting call for peace, even though we're not at war, and we have construction missing input. This is me just getting defensive as a hints thing. No, listen to me, don't listen to the hints. Then we have the agenda. This is the thing that you'll be confronted with when you first load up. It's a nice bit of historical context, and again, the relevant hints. Now we have these flags. They are color coordinated as to how urgent they are. Generally speaking, if something is worth knowing about, it'll pop up here. For example, we don't have any current research. Mining is inefficient. We need to pick our rivals. Once you're in a war, this will also show up here. Always a good idea to keep an eye on the flags. For example, if I were to be massively minting and I was going to have rising inflation, it will tell me. Down here, we have the numbers 1, 2, 3. What this is our control groups. It means that I can, with tapping 1, 2, 3 on my keyboard, navigate to the relevant control group. I can assign things to a control group by holding on control and tapping a number. For example, I'm selecting the city of Toledo and I'm putting that on 4. If I wanted to have the market of Sevilla, for example, I'm going to select it there and put it on 5. And this means that whilst navigating around, I can instantly go, oh, where are my armies? That's the first army. Hang on, I want to look at the market. That's the market of Sevilla. Over here, show me Toledo. It's quite a useful tool just so you can select the number and navigate to where you need to be. And then finally, we have the maps. There are so many maps in this game. If you would like a map to be pinned at the bottom, you can pin and unpin like this. You can also search up maps. So for example, the integration map mode, which I quite like. All right, let's dive into some buttons. This is the government. You can also hit F1. Over here, we have our king. In Europa Universalis 5, you play more as the spirit of the nation versus any certain king. But in this case, our king gives us the following bonuses because of their abilities. Abilities to scale from 0 to 100. 100 is fantastic. 0 is, well, you probably should have dropped them a little bit. I can't make that joke. You should have educated them more. We'll just say that. Your rulers also have traits, which will further give modifiers. Now, looking at our estates, I will teach you how to sort your estates later on, but know that these are your estates. This is how much estate power they have. The more power they have, the more powerful they are, and you have the population next to them. So everyone will be stratified into these estates here. And then we have your own crown power. Generally speaking, higher crown power is better. It gives you a lot of good bonuses. Bad crown power is very, very bad. Over here, we can grant privileges to the various estates at the cost of our own crown power. They also start with a lot of different ones. You can see here, for example, if I wanted to revoke this privilege, it would cost me some stability. So you'll start to get the sense that you want to manage your ducats, stability, legitimacy, as well as other resources, I guess you'd call them, to balance out your nation. Moving on, we have your parliament that you will call, that will give you certain bonuses. If you don't call a parliament in a long time, then your estates will get upset. You have your cabinet and your cabinet actions. At the start of the game especially, this is your bread and butter. These are going to be the guys that are going to be carrying out your will. For example, I have hired Alfonso de Guzman, 37, to be part of my cabinet, and he is going to perform various activities for me. You can only do one of these at a time, and he is going to be better at things that are military in this case, such as increasing stability, strengthening the government, cracking down on rebels. The more cabinet seats and the better your cabinet efficiency, the better. But again, we'll get into exactly how to manage these properly later on. And finally, we have our laws. There's a lot of these things. It's tricky to navigate them, but essentially this is what makes up our nation. For example, if I look at our levy lord, we currently have the Allard lord, which increases burgher power, increases levy recruitment speed, and gives us monthly progress to quality. I'll tell you what that is in a second. I can switch these out at the cost of stability for other laws that may be more beneficial to me. And that goes the same for all of them. You'll unlock certain laws with tech. You might also have special laws because of your culture. Then we have your nation's values. It's a binary scale from -1 to 1, essentially. The more towards one side you are, the more bonuses you get from that side. For example, we are 0.18 the way to decentralization. At maximum, we get all of these bonuses. At present, we get these bonuses. So the worst thing you want is being in the middle. For example, over here, we have no impact of quality versus quantity. These will change over time due to situations in the game. You can also use a cabinet action to push it one way or another. Your laws will also do the same. For example, traditional economy versus capital economy. We're currently being pushed heavily towards traditional economy because of our mining laws, because of our government reform of feudal nobility, our employment system, and so on and so forth. All right, that was just the first one. Buckle in. I did say it was going to be a guided tour. Next up, we have the balance screen. These have various sliders to manage your income and expenses. There are also other ones. If I click this, it's going to hide the unused ones. Because we don't have any mercenaries, we don't have any expenses. That's why they're hidden. But if you ever want to know what the other expenses are potentially, you can click that button. This is where we take out loans and pay off any debt that we might have. This is also our tax base. It's important to note from now, because it took me a little while to figure out. Your expenses, like your cost of your court and your stability, which are going to be, as you can see, incredibly expensive to put up to full scale with your tax base. Then we have the different markets that you are involved in or have a presence in. Don't worry, look, I can tell this is getting a bit much for you. Don't worry, I'm breaking it all down later. We're just going for a quick guided tour of the UI and what it all means. You're not going to be an expert at the end of this section. Then we have trading. Okay, look, there are more buttons. I get it. I get it. What is market automation? Again, we're going to get there. Moving on, we have our production. This is where our buildings, goods, and food are shown. The nice thing about Europa Universalis 5 is, let's say I want to search for the good of cloth. Okay, good. Well, here's cloth. Here is a building that produces cloth. Here's another building that produces cloth. And it's the same thing, for example, with things like manpower. Here are the buildings that will give me manpower. And if I hover over it, it will show me exactly what that looks like. These are the goods in my nation, the RGOs. RGOs is resource gathering operation. Why is it called that? Well, it's an operation. It's pretty obvious. I didn't choose these names. The number represents the amount that are there. So for example, over here in Medina del Campo, we have 3 out of 6. The maximum amount, as you can see, is going to scale from a lot of different factors. Technology will also impact this. But as you can see here, its output per level is 1.19. Therefore, there are 3 of them, which means I get roughly, why did I pick something that's 1.19? Like 3.57, I think it is. So again, if this was, for example, 0 out of 3,000, then you would see 3,000 peasants become laborers and go into that class. And finally, we have food. I'll go more into food later on, but for now, all you need to know is that some locations produce food. If, for example, I had 100,000 people in a city, they are not going to be producing food for themselves. They are going to have to import it from other places. That might be from abroad, that might be from other provinces within your market. Over here on the balance, again, you can see that I'm selling food. Then to this screen that I briefly showed you, this is the Society tab. We have further breakdowns into culture, religion, and people. These are the accepted cultures that are within your nation, as well as what percentage they are. These can go down to tiny, tiny amounts. For example, there are 198 Ligurian individuals living in Mercia. There's also where you can change the acceptance. We have our religion with various different decisions. Again, we'll get into this. I know it feels like I'm blasting through all these different things like conversion rate, but we'll get there when we get there. Trust me, we don't want to get bogged down. And then finally, we have our people that I showed you earlier. We have any rebels would pop up here, dynasties, as well as characters of significance. These can be courtiers, members of various groups, even like third or fourth cousins. Now on to diplomacy. These are our diplomatic relations. We have our diplomatic capacity up here. That's how many different diplomatic relations we can maintain. For example, things like alliances and vassals. We have our reputation, which is how likely that another nation are to accept our requests, I'll put it politely. And our current relations. For example, we are rivaled to Morocco. We have a royal marriage with Portugal. This tab just gives you your list of known countries. Frankly, I don't think you need to use this at all. One thing that's useful is our diplomatic range. So if something's outside of this diplomatic range, we are not allowed to interact with them. Then we have the various organizations that we know of, things like the Catholic Church, which we are a member of because we're Catholic, to the Holy Roman Empire, which we know about, but we aren't a member because we, well, aren't in there. We'll go so much deeper into international organizations later, but just know that international organizations can be things like churches, they can be things like political organizations and unions like the High Kingship of Ireland or the Tartar Yoke, and beyond. Then we have our actions and the various different diplomatic actions that we can do, such as declaring war, or even, for example, over down here, we can offer loans, request sound toll exemptions. Things can get kind of complicated, so we'll leave that to the diplomacy section. Over here we have our military. These have our various stats as well as our fort limit. We can only build a certain amount of forts. We can only raise our levies in war, but this would be the amount of levies that we can. We have a list of our various armies. We can recruit regulars from this screen over here as well. And we can also hire mercenaries. And it's a similar story for navies. Then switching over to geopolitics, we have territories. This is where we can colonize. We can colonize immediately. For example, right now I could colonize from La Coruña and it will go and do that. We would manage our colonies from here, and also we can see our provinces. And switching over, we have our maritime coast. This is going to relate to this. Our Maritime Presence. You might be asking what Maritime Presence is. And essentially, it's how much control we project over that specific sea tile. The more of this we can project, the better our control is over here. What's control? We'll get there when we get there. And then finally over here, we have our diseases. Various diseases that we will get will show up here. Let's say we have an outbreak of smallpox that kills 300,000 people. We'll be able to see that here, as well as the dreaded bubonic plague. That'll turn up as its own situation. Don't worry about that. You'll be very aware of it when it comes. No one has ever gone, oh wow, the bubonic plague just came and passed me by and I didn't even notice. Half your population will die. And finally on this tab, we have the different advances. This is the tech tree of Europa Universalis 5. It is incredibly long and convoluted, and these vary by ages. The game is split into these different ages here, and you can see that there are 3 different institutions that spawn with each age. Right now we have knowledge of feudalism and legalism, but we don't know about meritocracy, which spawned over in the east. This means that we cannot do this advance here and start on this tree because we don't have that institution. These will appear as we go into different ages and will unlock different advances. You can also search through here. For example, I want something that is going to help out with my stability. And you can see over here, anything that has the word stability in it, you will start to see it and it'll be highlighted. In terms of navigating this, I can queue them. For example, all right, I want organized religion. Actually, and then I want over here to go down to stability investment and it will queue them up for you. So that is your overview of the UI and what all the different buttons do. I imagine that has presented more questions than answers for you, and allow me to add more of them. So I'm gonna now look at automation. Automation is quite a good way of starting to figure out the game. A lot of old heads of grand strategy games like me were too proud to do this. I regret this, I should have done it. What this does is, at the start of the game, you will see production methods, for example, will be automated. Everything else will be unautomated. Automating things means that the game's AI will take care of that thing for you. For example, if I were to automate my balance, then over here, you can see I can't make any of the changes because the AI will decide what is good for me. Something at the start of the game that's quite good to automate would be trade, for example. And then if I if I load up the next month and let it tick over, you'll see that over here, the game has made selections for me, which means when I'm starting to learn the game, I don't need to figure out trade. I can focus on, for example, learning about buildings. I could focus on learning about the military. And that's a similar thing for all of these things. If you don't want to handle trade, it doesn't even have to be a learning thing. You don't have to handle aspects of this game you don't want to. If you have no interest in trade at all, you're not going to enjoy the trading part of the tutorials. But if you have no interest in trade, you can just let the AI automate it and go from there. Now, bear in mind, the AI is not a person. It will not understand your aims. So don't think it's automatically going to make the best choice for you. It's going to make the choice that the AI thinks is best, which are two subtly different things. So there are a lot of different things to automate here. My personal recommendation would be to, firstly, select these two. This is going to make the game automatically replace your generals and your admirals. This is tedious. I have several hundred hours in this game and I use this. There's no point not to. If, for example, you want the game to build for you but to leave you, let's say, 500 ducats, you can do that. And don't think the automation isn't useful or is somehow a cop-out. Because if I go over here and we start to look at the Great Yuan, we have 20,000 ducats in the bank and thousands of tiny locations to deal with. At this point, allowing it to sort out your buildings and keeping, let's say, 3,300 on hand is a good idea. And you can see that already it started to build for us. Look, you see, oh my god, it's started to build a lot of these RGOs. Like I said, it's at this point that the automation starts to make a lot of sense. Although I do know some people that hate this. They prefer to build it themselves. It's entirely up to you. You get to customize your experience there. Okay, now you should be familiar with the maps, the various buttons, what all these different icons mean, what the outlier is, and we have news down here as well as the different control groups. Within this video, I'm going to be taking you through all of the different aspects of the game. So by the end of it, you should have a very, very firm grasp on how to get going for Europa Universalis 5. To teach you about all things economy, we are going to be taking a look at England. This is where you can see the amount of money you'll make as well as the expenses that you incur. So we'll get to tax base and tax inefficiency and how they're calculated in a second. For now though, we can see that we have an income of 44.28 and expenditure of 26.84. The first thing here we have is minting. This is how much coinage that we're producing. If you know anything about 20th century Germany, you know whacking this up to maximum is going to give us a lot of money. I mean, literally 10x the amount we were making before almost, at the cost of inflation per month. Inflation, if you didn't know, is going to increase the cost of everything. Let's say a good costs 100 gold. If our inflation is 5%, it's now going to cost 105%. So minting can be good for short-term boosts of income, but you do want to bring it back down here. Generally speaking, you can adjust it a little bit to this kind of point where it's 0, or you can put it up a little bit more than that. Some of your primary source of income here are going to be the taxes on your various estates. As you may know, your population across your society is stratified into these different estates. And so here we have the lords, the clergy, the burgess, and the yeomanry. You can see that, for example, I can't increase tax beyond 29.75% over here. And for the clergy, I'm not allowed to tax them at all. If you hover over their names, then you can see exactly why that is. In this case, we are Catholics, then Catholics are not allowed to tax their clergy. Perhaps you want to switch to Protestantism, it might be a bit more lucrative for you. Whereas on the Lords side of things, there is the base value of 30%. We have our reform of English Parliament giving us a further 10%, and it's counterbalanced by the nobles' estate power. So the less power they have, the more we can tax them. In this case, for example, the yeomanry, we can tax them all the way up to 50%. So if you want to know exactly why there are maximum and minimum limits, you can see here. But as I do that, you'll start to see that that's going to annoy the estates. Exactly how to balance the estates I get to in my internal affairs tutorial. So for now, we're just going to be focusing on the economic side of things. If I hover over here, you can see where their money is coming from and how you're going to tax them. You can also automate all of this. Well, to be fair, you can automate your entire balance and then you won't be able to move any sliders and the AI will do all that for you. If you were to do this, then the AI is going to select a tax amount that is just about going to keep them loyal, like around here. And it's not a terrible idea to keep them like that, and then if you need short bursts of cash, whack them up. Then you have your trade income. You will either be buying or selling food, which is either going to gain you money or lose you money, depending if you're on a surplus or a deficit. And then we have our diplomacy. So these are coming from our vassals. This is very, very important in terms of making use of land versus sort of just taking large swathes. It'll make sense when I get to it, but for example, Aquitaine is going to be giving us more money from them controlling the territory and giving us money than we would make controlling this territory ourselves, at least until a late game. And then we have other sources of income. So for example, in this case, we have a Christian holy site, which makes a little bit of money. On the cost side of things, we have our legitimacy and our stability. This is going to scale with our tax base, so we'll touch on that in a second. Otherwise, we have our sliders for our navy, army, and fort maintenance. Again, these can be automated, and in times of war, they will shoot up automatically. Then finally down here, we have the buildings that we're paying for. For example, our cathedrals. We have 30 of those, and they are costing us 2.42. And then if you hover over that, it will show you each one and why it's costing you that amount. So with the nested tooltips, it's really useful to see. For example, we are spending 0.11 ducats on 0.05 units of glass. And you don't need to get into the numbers to understand that, well, if I dropped the price of glass by increasing the amount of glass that was being produced in my country, then that would be brought down. And this is how I want you to start thinking about buildings and the economy in Europa Universalis 5. Because this is where a lot of the fun comes in. If you're purely reactive, then you're not going to have as much fun as if you're starting to plan things out. And then finally, we have the building subsidies. For example, we are supplying the Naval Supplies Guild over here because we're going to need those naval supplies, even though it's not itself profitable. Okay, so tax base. What is our tax base? Well, tax base is the amount of money we get from these locations. So for example, London over here has a tax base of 9.8. The higher your tax base, the more that the cost of the court and your stability costs. So if I hover over cost of the court, you can see that at 100% investment, it is 12.83, and that scales from 10% of our economic base, plus these 1% from the aristocratic court and 1% from the fact that we have a national value or societal value pushing slightly towards aristocracy. So the idea is, as you become larger and grow your tax base, your expenses like keeping up your stability and your legitimacy will also increase. Also, I completely glossed over diplomatic spending. I'll go more into the importance of diplomatic spending when we get into the diplomacy section, but for now, this is also scaled with our economic base. It's important to say that our economic base is slightly different from our tax base. Our economic base is our tax base plus the volume of our trades and also like things like sound tolls. Whereas our tax base is purely all of our locations numbers here. Okay, I'm gonna switch to the control map mode for a second. And I'll explain what this is, but for now, know that over here, there is a difference between potential tax base and our actual tax base. In Truro, there is a potential tax base of 3.12, a third of London. This is quite a large place. However, because it scales with control, we actually have zero benefit from this location. And that doesn't factor in to this thing here. And finally, we have our tax efficiency. This is going to be a series of modifiers that you'll collect throughout the game. It'll also scale with your crown power, and that will, even though it doesn't tell you it here, that will affect how much tax you get. Let's keep it simple. If I was getting 1 ducat a month from the Lords and I had a tax efficiency of 10%, then I would get 1.1 ducat the following month as opposed to the previous one. So looking at effective tax base versus tax base, this is the control map mode, and we have a lot of different numbers. Control scales from 0 all the way up to 100. Your capital will always be 100. And you might start to see a trend here that is to a degree radiating outwards. Our control is radiating outwards from our capital, and that's because that is essentially what it does. If, for example, I were to take this province here, Lowestoft, I'm English, I should be able to pronounce that. We can see that it has a potential tax base of 4.75. However, it has an effective tax base of 2.58 because it's scaled with control. Control has a bunch of different effects. You can see that here. I can't think of a single reason why you wouldn't want 100% control in every location. And so that's something you'll want to try and strive towards. That is not going to be an achievable aim until much later in the game. I'm talking hundreds of years. But for now, know that the more control, the better. Because having 54% control means we get less of the economic benefit, and all of these things are scaled. We get fewer levies, we're able to have fewer people assimilate and convert to, in this case, Catholicism and the English culture. We get less manpower, and also, crucially, we have a lowered pop promotion speed. A pop promotion speed, in case you were wondering, is if I were to build, let's say, over here, a bunch of breweries. Then we need burghers to staff them. This is going to put us in a deficit of 900 burghers. We need 900 individuals to go into this class of people, and it's going to bring it up slowly over time from there. But because of the control, that is going to be slowed by 57%. So what sort of things impact control? Well, if we hover over here, we can see that the maximum control is scaled due to it being a core. The proximity to the capital increases it by 0.35%, and the average satisfaction. So if people are happy, there'll be more control. If they are unhappy, less control. If it's a core territory means that more than 50% of the people living here, in Whitby it's 26,000, so roughly 13,000 and some change, are of the English culture or an accepted culture. So in this case, Northumbrian is an accepted culture, and therefore this place becomes our core. Which means even if we can't reach the territory, if it's our core, then we will still get 20% control as a base, and then the other modifiers will either increase it or hinder it. But this is the key part here, the proximity to capital. The further something is away to the capital, the further something is away from the capital, the harder it is for us to exert control over it. And you can see here that we have that 0.47%. The way proximity is calculated, and it's a different map mode here. That's the roads map mode, Laith. The way proximity is calculated is each province, including sea tiles, has a movement cost. So in this case, the lowest movement cost is to go from London into the Thames, then into the Anglican coast, then into the Humber estuary, then up here into Flamborough Head. It's not a real place. And then Whitby. It is a real place. So you can start to see the importance of coastlines. The best way I can tell you about proximity is how hard is it to get to a place. For example, if it's over mountains, let's say Serbia, if I show off the proximity cost over here, the mountains are going to make life a lot harder. So you'll start to get the understanding that to exert control over territories, we want to get the proximity cost down as low as possible. And you'll see for some of these territories, we have basically no proximity. Hovering over the proximity, we can see all of the different steps. So London to Harrow costs 18 movement. And if you think 100 is the province itself, even Harrow itself is going to have minus 18.6%. So it's only got 81% proximity. And that's right next door to London. So you can start to understand how this sort of compounds. Hovering over why that is 18.64, we can find out that proximity cost through land is plus 40. There is a gravel road here, dropping it by a flat number of 20. The farmlands increase it by 5%, and then the development and the fact there's a bridge further reduce it, resulting in this score. So if I show you the roads map mode, we already have some roads being built up here. And that is going to make this proximity cost lower. But for the most part, the coastline was a lot easier to control. So over here, London, we can see, has a harbour capacity of 95%. It is very, very, very suitable. There's even a map mode, I think, for natural harbours. Yeah, there is. Natural harbour suitability. So you can see which provinces in the world have natural harbour suitability, which is going to help with this harbour capacity. And that harbour capacity is right here, going to reduce the proximity cost in the port. So looking at Newcastle, for example, which has a good harbour capacity, that reduces the proximity cost through port, and it's at minus 2% proximity, whereas the one next to it has minus 17%. Okay, so looking at projecting our control into the ocean here. If I want to increase my control over Yarmouth, for example, and reduce that proximity cost, what I need to be doing is having a maritime presence. If I select the sea tile, over here, there is a thing called Maritime Presence. There is a base level of decay of Maritime Presence, but essentially, the more Maritime Presence you have, the lower the proximity cost of going into the sea tile, the easier it is. So if I go over here to my Maritime Presence map mode, and to be clear, I believe blue is good and green is bad. I don't know why it was done like that. Yeah, you can see here 0% is green and blue is 100%, so it's really hard to tell. But if I have this Maritime Presence up really high, it's going to lower that proximity cost and help me to project control. Which explains why over here, even though it's across the sea tile, I have 23 control and 35% proximity to the capital versus something on the same island just a few provinces away. We are now going to compare that to the year 1807. We are almost 500 years into the future. Now, this was an observer game that I did just to see what the AI would do. So this isn't my game. I want to make that very clear. And you can see the control is a lot better. Up here in Newcastle, we have 90 control. A base of 70 to be fair, so it's going to tick down. But that proximity cost is way less. From London into the Thames is now 0.01. And you can see that's because of the development. There's a bridge there, the harbour capacity, centralisation, societal value, and also the technology. Going for this proximity map mode again, and this is very, very different. We have modern roads here, and the development helps out. And we're back in 1337 with a lot less control. You can use buildings to help out with that. For example, if I build a temple, it's going to give plus 5% control. Things like a royal forest will also help out in rural settlements, as well as having urban settlements. For example, Coventry is a town and therefore gives another 5%. Bordeaux, for example, is a city, so it gives 10%. Okay, so we've established that control is important. So let me now take you through this entire screen. At a glance, we can see the fortifications, the amount of people living here, as well as how happy they are. The market access, which is very, very important. For example, if the market access over here is 84%, that means that a building like this tools guild, if this location had 100% market access, it would produce one tool unit, input good, whatever you want to call it, one unit of tools. However, right now it only makes 0.85. Then we have the control, which we discussed, and then we have the RGO. These are the raw materials in the world. Every single province has one raw material. Each of these goods has a base price, which is dynamically changed with trade and the markets. I'll get more into that on the trading side of things. But for example, London has 3 levels of wheat, which employs 3,000 laborers and makes 0.66 profit per level. We'll get into more of how to use these RGOs effectively in a second. But then we move on to the development. Development is very important. At the top here, you can see how much it's changing by and what's going to impact those things. And then down here, the effectiveness of it. So for example, a development of 34 results in you can have more buildings. Buildings also cost less. People are more likely to move there. Essentially, the more development, the better. People also live longer here, which I quite like. One thing that impacts our development is our prosperity. So a more prosperous place is going to drive up development. Then here we have our works of art. Then in this tiny little icon here, we can see how many buildings we A, have and B, can support. So we have 25 buildings here. We can support 144. The number of institutions that we have here, the food productivity, as well as the amount of food. So we can see the food units produced and the food units consumed, which actually balances out quite nicely here. However, we can't have people starving, and so we will get that 0.09 food from the London market. More rural places, as you can see here, will produce more food, whereas urban places generally tend to consume food because you have fewer people in subsistence farming. And individuals are like the burghers, for example, they're busy making things like tools, and so they aren't going to be producing food, they'll only consume it. Also, different pops consume different food. For example, 1,000 nobles need 20 food, whereas each 1,000 peasants only needs 1 food. So as you get more and more burghers, for example, you need to have more food available to them from different locations. That's determined on a market level. And so over here in London, we can see that we have a monthly balance of plus 2,000 food. If that goes below, people are going to start starving, and you'll have to start importing food. So going back to our balance, you can see that we actually end up selling food. Whereas, let's say a nation like Holland, which is smaller and much more urbanized, is going to be buying food. So if an urban settlement is going to cost me food, and I'm gonna have to buy it, why would I ever want to have an urban environment? That's because you're gonna make a lot of money here. For example, this wheat RGO per level makes 0.66 profit. However, this Distillers Guild, which has these inputs and produces, I think it's just called alcohol, we'll sell that for a lot more. And the important thing here, it will create profit for you to then be able to tax your estates, and as well as the fact that they are purchasing goods on the market. So they're purchasing pottery and purchasing glass. Then the money doesn't just disappear. It's being reinvested into your own economy. I don't need to give you an economics lesson for this to become clear. If I have a glass guild in Colchester over here, for example, that's producing glass, it's going to sell those on the market. The guys here are going to be buying it. Everyone's making profit and everyone's paying back into me. That is going to increase our tax base, because tax base isn't just the amount of people, It's calculated by the combined profit of your RGOs and buildings in a location. So let's take a look at these buildings more closely. If you select up here, production, you can click on this buildings tab, and then you can see a bunch of buildings that you can produce. Hovering over each one will tell you exactly what the inputs are in terms of production method. We'll get to that in a second, as well as what each of these things do. It's important to distinguish between rural settlements and urban ones. This over here embarking is a rural settlement. You can tell by this little dot up here, which means it has a higher RGO size, and I cannot build urban buildings there. So for example, that Distillers Guild can't happen embarking. Unless, of course, I spend the money to found a town. Both with buildings and things with founding towns, the cost of doing these actions or building a building has a base cost. It's then affected by the inflation, as we discussed earlier, and then you have the input goods. For example, masonry and lumber is cheaper on the English market, and therefore I have a massive reduction on how much this is going to cost. It should cost 500. It's actually going to cost 400, and that's the same thing with buildings. For example, if I want to build a brewery over here, I can see that's going to cost 30. The base cost is 45. That has been scaled down by the development in the location, my ruler's admin ability, and then is further scaled down by the masonry. So think to yourself, cheap construction goods means cheap construction. And if you like this kind of stuff, you'll already be starting to think, okay, well, here's one strategy that I can do. Here's what I can, maybe if I build a load of wood RGOs. If I go over here and click goods, I'm going to type in lumber, and I'm going to build a load of lumber to make lumber super cheap in this market to make future constructions a lot easier. Or you can import a load of cheap lumber at a loss to facilitate construction a lot easier in your country. But that is for trade. So we're going to look at the Spinners Guild, which is my favorite building for the UK. The reason for this is this production method. Different buildings have the possibility of having different production methods. Some are unlocked by technology. For example, for right now, the Papers Maker Guild can either use leather and lumber to create 0.5 paper, or it could use fiber crops and lumber to create 1 paper. This one over here, rag paper, which would use cloth and lumber, will be unlocked with technology. By default, the game selects the most profitable production method for you because of this. This is not a bad thing to have on. But as always with this game, the most profitable isn't necessarily the best. Let's say I have the technology for rag paper and I have a booming cloth industry. Well, then I want to switch over my paper making guild to rag paper. Even though it makes paper more expensive to produce, it facilitates a demand for my cloth, which employs more people, more tax, yada yada. So looking at the Spinners Guild, we can also make cloth with cotton, something that we don't have right now, but will be abundant when we go through the whole colonization thing. So I'll give you an example. If I were to colonize and get a load of cotton, I could flood the markets of Europe with very, very cheap cloth because cotton is better than wool for producing cloth. I like to do this even earlier because the reason that I like Spinners Guild so much as England is because of wool. Wool is everywhere in England, and you start off with a ton of these RGOs. This means that for me to produce cloth, it is very, very cheap. And that also means that later on I can produce paper with cheap cloth, meaning cheap paper, and everyone's employed. The game will try and estimate the profit here. If I sort by the amount of profit it's going to make, London's the most profitable at 2.5, and we're going to get 100% of the benefit from that because of our control, versus somewhere like Berwick, which is going to be making 1.24, but we're going to lose 93% of that due to the low control. So generally speaking, you want your buildings concentrated around your capital, in your capital, because that's where you're going to get the most amount of benefit from them. So the game will try and tell you what it thinks the most profitable things are for you to build. Same thing with goods, and it'll show you how much you're going to make per level. But like I said, let's say I want to go into tooling industries and I want to drop the price of tools and sell tools, then I'm going to need cheap iron. So I'm going to prioritize iron, even though it won't make me as much as horses because of those supply chains. It'll also tell you what your pop needs are here. For example, our pops really want fruit. So it might be an idea to get fruit, even though it's less profitable just to secure those population needs, to make people happy, get them to pay more taxes, less likely to join rebel groups, as well as increase our development. Another thing you might want to note is that you can get even more efficiency by putting the right buildings in the right locations when it comes to RGOs. For example, in London, we have wheat, which means this distillery actually gets a bonus because we are distilling wheat. If I hover over production efficiency, we get plus 9% because there's wheat in Middlesex. So for example, a Spinners Guild over here in Lynn is going to have plus 10% efficiency, whereas a Spinners Guild in London isn't going to have those same bonuses. But as a consequence, we're only going to get 38% of the profits. So let's go a little bit more advanced. Why would I want to use vassals? Well, up here in Berwick, this is not an integrated territory. So we need to use a cabinet action to integrate it. This takes a long time. Berwick is a sole territory. It has 50,000 people in it, which is quite a lot to be fair. Especially at the start of the game, with a bunch of bonuses, it's still going to take us a good sort of 7 years or so. And that's for one province. So down here, I have diplomatically annexed Aquitaine using console commands. And so all these areas are already integrated, but we get 0 control from them. We don't get any benefit from this at all. And so all this territory gives me is unhappy individuals and areas to defend. However, if I navigate to the relations screen and I create a subject, I can create Aquitaine as a fiefdom. You'll see that they actually enjoy a decent amount of control of their land because their capital's here, so that proximity cost is a lot lower. And instead of that roughly 0 ducats I was getting from the territory before, Aquitaine is now giving me 3.46. So in areas that I can't project good amounts of control into, particularly inland areas, I want to be using vassals to get the most out of an area until I can project control into an area. The final thing I'll say about control, if we're going a bit more in depth, is so very broad macro strategy. You want to increase your control through reducing the proximity cost of areas, so increasing the proximity to capital through things like the road builder and building roads. You want to improve your maritime presence to project control into the ocean and prioritize taking land that you can push control into. For example, this north coast of France, it's 2 sea tiles. I could probably better project into there than Skipton. For areas further afield, using vassals is paramount. If you do want to boost the productivity of your buildings, then lowering the price of the input goods will give you a lot more profit. And as always, make sure to get as much crown power as possible to benefit from that as much as possible. The other thing you need to look out for in terms of control are things like stannery courts. This is an example of a building that an estate will build that will lower your maximum control, because the estates will also be building this entire time. Sometimes they'll be building things that will help you, and sometimes they might build things that are going to hinder your control. In order to discuss anything to do with trade, first we need to discuss markets, what they are, what they do, how they work, and all of that good stuff. This is what markets look like in the 1st of April 1337 at the start of EU5. In this game, we are playing as Hungary, and so Pest is our main market. You can see here, we can navigate up to this screen, and we can see the different markets that we have a presence in. Some of our locations belong to this market in Krakow, some of them belong to Venice, but the majority are in Pest, and we are the market controller of Pest. What does that mean? I will get to that, don't you worry. Just hovering over any market, we can see the total value over here, we can see the greatest surplus, greatest needs, as well as things like the trade advantage, trade capacity. For Pest, it's only us, we're a bit lonely. Over here in Venice, it's a little bit more complicated. So first things first, why are some of these locations in the Pest market and some of them are in the Venice one? So first things first, why are some of these locations that I own in the Pest market and some in the Venice market? So a way that this market works is that all of these different locations that exist within the market are going to buy and sell their goods here. For example, over here in this, I should have picked an easier province to pronounce. Pest! Over here in Pest, we have some wheat as an RGO. That's going to be sold. We also have buildings. So, for example, over here, this building uses copper and also tin to produce tools. So it's going to purchase that copper and tin on this market. It's also then going to sell the tools on that market. So what determines if a location is in one market or not? Like I said, over here, these guys are in Venice, even though they are mine. So this wheat gets sold on the Venetian market, not my market. We can hover over here and see why. You can see that the highest market traction, just about barely, is Venice versus Pest. So what determines our market's attraction? Well, let's start top down. Firstly, we have Hungary's impact. So that's our national impact on all of our markets. That is coming in now from prestige and trade income versus our tax base. That is going to extend to all of our markets. Looking at Pest directly, it's further helped along by the development in Pest as well as the staff buildings in the location. And compare this 3.62% to Venice's almost 10%, and you'll find quickly that places like Zagreb, which should come to my market, will instead flip to Venice. And then coming down to an individual location basis, generally speaking, it's also going to be impacted by how easily they can get to the market capital. you can see the route that they're going to take. So for example, if I were to build infrastructure all the way down here to Zagreb, I was to facilitate that through roads, then Zagreb is likely to flip to me. There is another thing to consider here, which is market protection. Over here, we have 0% market protection, but this is essentially going to impact how likely a location is to leave our market and go to someone else's. Obviously, it's not going to come into play if we're flipping between two markets that we own ourselves. Now, looking at the market as a whole, we can see the price of these things. So each good has a base price, which is then modified. For example, stone has a base price of 1, and then because of how much supply versus demand, its price has dropped by almost 90%. At current, the range is from minus 90% to 500%. That is how much the base price can be changed by. This doesn't happen instantly. You can see there's a monthly change slowly ticking towards this target price here. On the flip side, you can see that things like fur and fine cloth, their price is trending upwards. We're going to see a target price of 18 reached here at some point. So the buildings in the pest market will purchase goods at the price on the market. For example, if you have a weavery or something that produces cloth, then you're going to use potentially wool as an input. So the cheaper the wool that you have in your market, the more profitable that building. Equally, if the price of wool skyrockets, maybe that is no longer profitable. And that's something you can force in other markets, but we'll get into economic warfare in a little bit. The main question you might be asking yourself is, how do I make money here? Well, the game does suggest certain trades here for profit. If you go over here and automate trade, then the game will select the most profitable trade for you. It's not going to be as good as a human. Let's get that out of the way. Equally, if you need specific goods, let's say you want to, in the aforementioned example, drop the price of wool, maybe you're trying to import wool in for cheap. So even if it doesn't make the most economic sense in a purely trading perspective, it makes more sense in terms of your supply chains. But that's a little bit complicated, so let's look at just making money off of some trades. So over here, I can export some dyes from Pest to Prague. We make our money on the difference between these things. So the current price of dyes in Prague is 4, the current price over here in Pest is 1. So let's go ahead and facilitate that trade. All right, we've ticked over a month and we can see here that we are trading 3 dye and we're making a really quite a nice profit of 8.31. Various things can affect how much money you make here. The goods we purchase on the Pest market, you can see that over here. 3 of them have been purchased for this price. Then it's going to be exported to the Prague market where it is sold at the Prague price. Then we have the other factors. So the maintenance cost. You can see here the base cost is 0.05 ducats per unit of trade capacity used. And then we have other expenses potentially like sound tolls. So generally speaking, the more efficient and close a market is, the less expensive it's going to be. If I'm exporting my dyes to, let's say, South Africa, that is going to be a lot more expensive. On top of that, some locations have things like sound tolls. For example, if I'm going to import goods through here, I'm probably going to get charged a sound toll by the Danes. This is historically how a lot of people made a lot of money. Simply put down a castle overlooking the sea. Hey presto, only let people in that give you money. So that is very simply how to make money off of trade, but that isn't the actual money I'm going to be making here. You can see that I only make 1.72. Why is that? Well, when a trade is profitable, the profits are split amongst the estates, the various interested parties in your nation. So over here, we have 20% crown power, and so we are going to get 20% of that trade. The higher your crown power, the more money you make off of these trades. So how do I trade more? I don't actually have any trade capacity left in my market. Trade capacity is the resource that you use to facilitate trades. In this case, I have 2.1 trade capacity, and so I can use 2.1 trade capacity to push trade. That's either importing or exporting from a market. If I were to import from Prague, then I would use my trade capacity. If I'm to export from Pest to Prague, I'm going to use my trade capacity. Now, it's important to note that this trade capacity is split between markets. This is where things are going to get a little bit more complicated. I don't have any trade capacity in the Venice market, which means that I can't export goods that are produced and sold from Venice, nor can I import them to Venice. That doesn't mean I can't import from Venice into Pest, because I'd be using my Pest trade capacity. That's kind of the tricky part that took me a long time to realize, I'm not gonna lie, an embarrassing long amount of time. So let's say I wanted to get more trade capacity in Venice, then I would make sure to build marketplaces over here in Zagreb. Handily, if I'm gonna search buildings, I can do things like trade capacity, and it'll tell you different buildings that produce trade capacity. Some of them we can build, some of them can't, some of them come in a little bit later on, some of them are locked off to us. So the main one we're going to be focusing on, and one that you should get at the start of the game, is this, a marketplace. Each marketplace is going to, provided you have the full employment, give you 1 trade advantage and 1 trade capacity. It's also going to increase the burghers' trade capacity because they're going to be trading at the same time. That's kind of their whole thing, of course. So let's go ahead and build a couple of these in different locations. And so at this point, I'd like to point out that the cost of actually getting these buildings is impacted by the price of the goods. So if I flood my market with really cheap lumber and masonry, it's going to make construction a lot cheaper in my markets where I'm building those things. Okay, so most of our marketplaces are done. If we have a look over here now, we have a lot more trade capacity over in Pest and some over in Venice. Also, you can automate individual markets here, so you don't have to focus on tiny markets. So for example, Venice does not represent that big of an economic deal for me, so I might just automate that and focus on Pest. But let's have a look at our current trades. You can see here that I'm actually importing legumes from Nuremberg to Venice. Even though I'm not the market controller, even though I'm not a big player in Venice, I can still facilitate those trades. I can adjust the amount of trade capacity I'm using over here in each one. And then I can click this to create a new trade. So you can see now our trade income has doubled because of all of those marketplaces. And that's not the only benefit of this. Obviously, if I am selling produced goods to other markets, my people are employed making me money and giving me tax. I can also tax the estates. So it's not just the singular way I make money. This is a very systemic game and it's very intertwined. But let's talk about this thing here, trade advantage. Let's say there are only 5 horses on the Venice market. I want 5 horses, so I put in my order for 5 horses. Venice also wants 5 horses, but because of their trade advantage, they get their needs fulfilled first. Let's say I have a reliable import of amber, so I'm importing from Kiev and it's going to Pest. I'm going to be using that amber in my Jewelers Guild to produce jewelry. Suddenly, Georgia, who have for some reason become a trading republic, have a much higher trade advantage than I do over here in the Kiev market, and they order all of the amber. Suddenly, my industry is starting to collapse. So you might start to understand how you might do a little bit of economic warfare. So what are the different ways that you can improve your trade advantage? Well, it's back to the handy search bar over here. You can see that marketplaces give us trade advantages. There's obviously these trading posts, trade office, market warehouses, even market villages, which can be built in rural locations, will also give you trade advantage. So why don't I give you a little example over here? I've tagged into Venice and they're immediately at war. Okay, good stuff, Venice. Over here in Venice, we have some tools guild, and we're using iron for that. So hypothetically, let's say Barcelona, for whatever reason, was a fantastic source of iron. What I would want to do is make sure that I have as much trade advantage over there as possible so that I could be the first person to buy all the cheap iron to import it into my Venice market to mean that my produced goods are now way more profitable. I can also do that to such an extent that I can starve nations of their own resources. Remember, these RGOs are producing goods and selling them on the market, but if I have the highest trade advantage in places like Paris, Bordeaux, and Barcelona, I can stop the French from producing, let's say, fine cloth by buying all of their raw resources before they can make use of it. This will make you really unpopular in multiplayer. So you can see that Venice, a trade-focused nation, is present in a lot of different markets and so can facilitate more trades. The final thing to note here is trade range. So that determines which markets I can and cannot trade with. Everything you see here that's colored, I can actually trade with because I have enough trade range. London, unfortunately, is a little bit too far away. As Austria, for example, I'm rather nastily sandwiched between a lot of different markets whose market capitals I'm far from. You see Vienna, my capital, belongs to the Nuremberg market, which is really quite far away. So, which means any buildings in Vienna are going to have a lower purchasing priority than a building in Nuremberg, for example. So that might be a good idea to create your own market. And you'll see the AI do this quite often. So let's say I'm going to go now and create my own market. How do I do that? Well, I navigate over here and there's a big old button saying create market. I'm going to click this and then all of the options pop up. And the price of it is determined as to how close you are to the market capital that you're currently in. Essentially, if you have lower market access because you're really far away, it's going to be a lot cheaper. It's easy to see over here where this only costs 98 because of how far away it is from Pest, whereas this one over here is going to cost us 318. Another thing to note when it comes to your buildings is the possible production methods. The game by default, if you have it automated, will select the best one for you. But this is where you can get a bit proactive in how you play the trade game in EU5. If you know that you can secure a really cheap source of stone or perhaps really cheap copper and tin, that is going to make your tools a lot more profitable in this case, and you can price out your competition. With spinner guilds, for example, in England, wool is an incredibly abundant resource. Later on though, for example, we know that over in the New World, cotton might be a very, very valuable replacement. So if I rush to the New World, I build up a massive source of cotton, I import it into my London market from another one of my markets, then I can produce cloth a lot cheaper than everyone else in Europe, and thus I can start to price them out. Equally, what I could also do at the start of the game is start exporting wool to different markets to make wool a lot cheaper and make them dependent on English wool. More than any other game, I feel like you can start to mess with your opponents economically, which is really, really cool. That is a very, very, very brief and basic overview of the trade system and how you can take advantage of it in Europa Universalis 5. Using these concepts, you can extrapolate further and start to do things like the triangle trade, for example, securing slaves in West Africa, cash crops over in the New World, and export them to a hungry populace over in England. If you're going to remember anything from this tutorial, it's that the most profitable thing might not be the best thing long term, because everything has a knock-on effect. So when you start to understand it and fully engage with it, this becomes a lot of fun. My advice for new players: turn on automation for these smaller markets. You don't need to mess with them. Start to get to grips with one market. Build a ton of marketplaces. A nation like Hungary is really, really good to start with. That's my recommendation, to start playing around with markets, because you dominate your own market. No one else is in there, and you can monitor the ins and outs. Later on, if you want to get a little bit more fancy and start to do some economic warfare, I would highly recommend Venice. So I am going to declare war on Portugal as Castile. Before we look at any battles, it's important to have a look at the troops. So over here, we have our military screen. These are the different modifiers that we get. Each of these does a slightly different thing. You can find out the exact numbers by hovering over, but generally speaking, we have army tradition, which is going to help your morale and siege ability, your army experience, which will decrease the amount of damage that is taken. That's very important, and you'll see why in a bit. We have our morale, that's how long we can stay in a battle for. Discipline is how much damage we do to the opponent, and it also negates damage that we receive. Military tactics will negate damage that we receive. And then we have infantry, cavalry, artillery, and auxiliary power. Those are modifiers that are added to our damage calculations. At the top here, we have our fort limit. That's how many forts, weirdly enough, that we can have. And we'll get into the navy in a bit. For now, we have a couple of options in front of us. We have raising our levies, recruiting regulars, and hiring mercenaries. At the start of the game, Castile starts with 200 professional troops. These are individuals that are supplied with this manpower up here. If they take casualties, then it's replenished via this manpower. You get this manpower via getting buildings, such as the sergeantry, and you won't actually be able to recruit any professional troops until you have a building like the sergeantry. So over here, if you're wondering why, I can't build any troops in Europa Universalis 5, why is that? You need to have a building that will allow you to recruit regiments here. So if I search can recruit regiments, there's an order stronghold, and sergeantry are the ones that will do it. This also changes technology. Let's not forget we are in the 14th century. Professional troops weren't exactly commonplace here. So I can recruit regulars, and they are split into different types. We have camp followers, which are your auxiliaries. They're going to carry supplies for you. We'll get into why that's important in a little bit, as well as we have some different cavalry and some different types of foot soldiers here. However, we have a lot of battle statistics that we are going to get to. This is going to determine how your unit performs in battle. But at the start of the game, particularly in the 14th century, with few exceptions, you will mostly be fighting with levies. So over here, we can raise all of our levies and click this button up here. We can raise in certain areas if we don't want to raise everyone. Bear in mind that this is your population. So if 50,000 people die, then 50,000 members of your population are going not to turn back up to the fields. So I'm going to raise my army levies, and we're going to play the game a little bit. I find it more useful to select all of my armies on the outlier here. And we're going to gather everyone in Segovia. All right, we gather everyone up. We can tap G to merge them, or we can attach them to each other. What that means is that if I select this army, for example, then this one will always follow it around if it's attached. But for now, we're just going to merge them. It's a very confusing script. We're going to go through it all, don't worry. The top left is our general. Right now, we don't actually have a general, but let's select one here. We're going to get a Jacinto. I would recommend, it's jumping ahead a little bit here, but I would recommend that going onto automation and scrolling all the way down, you always want to select replace generals and admirals, because let's say you have 10 different armies across 4 different continents. You don't want to have to click and select each general manually. It's not instantaneous for these guys just to turn up. You can see it's going to take a round 2 weeks for him to get to his army, and then he will be effective. So we're going to wait for that. He has the following stats in admin, diplo, and military, which is going to have effects on the army depending on how good those abilities are. That scales from 0 to 100. So it's not just his military ability that is good here. Again, these are all going to be lots of different modifiers, and I'm going to be honest with you, it's a complicated thing, the battle system. I had to sit down with a buddy of mine, One Proud Bavarian, and we were combing through the code of the game and running battle after battle to figure out exactly what is going on. So at the top here, we can see the different unit types. We have 46,000 infantry units and around 300 cavalry. We don't have any cannons, and we don't have any auxiliary. This is the transport capacity necessary to transport these troops. If, for example, we have a navy with 3,000, we're going to have to split this in two, and we can only take them piecemeal. Down here, we have how much these guys are costing, as well as the unit weight. The unit weight is how much supply these guys are going to be using. So if I check out the supply map mode, it's a little bit rough. So you can start to see why we might want to be splitting up this army. Down here is the list of all of our units. And then we have various buttons that will do different things. For the most part, you can hover over each one and figure it out. They're not particularly complicated. For example, if you want to split the army in half, you click that button. Balancing, we'll get to in a second. Consolidation, the button I've just clicked, is a very good thing because it merges units together to create a full strength unit. You can also do things like detaching your support, detaching your levies. Over here, you can shattered retreat. So if we are in someone else's territory, we can basically sacrifice half our men to leg it out of there. Shattered retreat means that you cannot be engaged when you're running away. You run faster, and even if you're standing on the same tile or province as the enemy, you're not going to fight, you're just going to leave. Then through here, we have the different attachments we can do. We can scorch the earth, so right now I could just burn my capital if I wanted to. And then there are a couple of other abilities we don't have access to right now. For example, creating a supply depot, as well as marching to the sound of guns. We don't need to worry about those for right now. Now, balancing the units. What this does is splits our units evenly into the fronts. You'll see this visually when we get to the battles, but armies are split into 3 flanks as well as the reserves, and they will engage the front in front of them. So if I have, for example, if I select formation, which is where I can change formations if I have something particular in mind, we'll get to strategies later. If I do this, then you can see that I'll have no one on my left flank, which means that no one is going to be defending that flank. And we are going to get flanked. That's a lot of ways of saying flanked, but you'll see why that's a really, really bad thing in a sec. Especially at the start, you do want to just keep clicking that balance button, and it should generally select even numbers for you. You'll see as I move, I'm losing morale. It's meant to represent our army not being as cohesive. Also, you can see in the art style, the sort of level of professionalism in our troops. They are right now all very differently dressed. They're holding farmers' implements. We can tell that this is not a very strong army. We look at the Portuguese, and it's a little bit more professional, but also has a lot of these individuals. Later on, let's say in the 1800s, you will have a fully professional army, and these guys are all going to look like redcoats marching in unison. General rule, if you look over the hills and you see a bunch of men in uniform marching over, you know without looking at it, you're about to have a rough time. Hovering over the enemy here, they're currently sieging down this province. We'll get to sieges in a little bit, but I can see that they have 3 units of professional troops, and the others are levies. So we are going to go and engage if he doesn't try and leg it. If you're selecting an army and you're not on speed 2, when you enter into a battle, the game will automatically chuck you onto speed 2 so you can see what's happening. Battles happen on hourly ticks, so they are over very, very fast if you're on something like speed 5. Okay, so the battle has engaged. This is the battle screen. Let me go through how battles work. As you can see in front of us, we have the 3 flanks and the reserves. It's the same thing for our opponent. At the top, we can see our morale versus his morale. This is an average of the morales we're seeing here. Bear in mind, our morale is low because we marched without stopping all the way up from Segovia, meaning that if we were playing properly, would stand in a province and try and get our morale back, but that would also enable him to run away. So there's a lot of tactics that come around with that. Up here, we can see our stats versus his stats. For example, we see that his morale is 3.56 versus our 4.17. This is your max morale, to be clear. Here, we see the dice roll. This is going to represent the base damage before all modifiers are added and multiplied, and the equations are put in, and higher number is better. This is also affected by things like your terrain. For example, we have marched in over here, and that's going to give a penalty of +2 to the attacker in combat. Because it's a fort, we get the defender bonus, which means that Portugal actually rolled a 4, but they get -2 to their dice roll. We rolled terribly, we rolled a 1, but you can start to understand that managing the terrain is a very good idea. For example, if I were to march into Beja, I'm not Spanish, I can't pronounce that, then we would get a -3 to our dice rolls. Okay, let's dive into battles in their entirety. I'm going to explain piecemeal how each aspect works in a way that I think is easy to understand. And by the end of the section, I'll have explained everything. So, to begin, there are 2 types of damage that these units do. There's strength damage and there's morale damage. Strength damage is the act of killing troops. Morale damage is dropping their morale. So why do I have troops actually fighting and they don't? Well, let's go through the different sort of sections here. These are your reserves. These guys will try and join the battle when there is available frontage. If I hover over, for example, the center, you can see how much frontage is being used. Right now, there are 3 levies on this front, representing 3 frontage out of a possible 7.67. You can see our frontage is contingent on the location, the vegetation, the topography, as well as our general's admin ability. Our general's admin ability is very, very good, so it has roughly 10 plus 10%, and then the woods and the plateau minus it a little bit. At a glance, you can see the frontage up here. So the more frontage, the more troops can actually get onto the front line. So you can see that there's around 4.6 available frontage, so why haven't 4 units joined here? Well, they are trying to engage. Units don't automatically get onto the front lines. That's why we're not actually facing anyone on this side of things. This is where this initiative stat comes in. So, and bear with me here. I'll explain it in sort of plain English first, and then I'll get into how this works. But essentially, every hour, each unit is going to try and join the battle. They are more likely to the higher initiative they have. These guys have 1 initiative, so our initiative is quite low, versus, for example, this cavalry unit, which has an initiative of 2. So higher the initiative, the more likely they are to join the battle. That's the basics. Let's go into exactly what that means. So every tick, so every hour, a D100 is rolled, and let's say it rolls a 50 in this case. So for this unit that's on the back row, we have an initiative of 1. That's multiplied by 0.02. You add that together to 0.02 multiplied by the amount of hours. In this case, it's your only 1 hour has been in combat. So we come out with 4, basically. 0.04. That is lower than the 50, and therefore it doesn't join the battle. You can choose to refer to the plain English or the maths. It's entirely up to you. So you can start to see that, for example, if this unit had 7 initiative, then that chance would go up to 18% instead of 4%. Usually high initiative troops are a lot weaker, but they can take to the front line a lot quicker. And so these individuals here, along with these 2, managed to roll sufficiently, I guess, low enough that they were able to join the battle. We'll get to these guys who aren't engaging anyone in a second. For now, let's have a look at this. So this is how damage is calculated. I will say that there is work being done on the tooltips, and battles are likely to be tweaked and changed, so I'm going to go over the basic concepts versus specific numbers here. It's a good job I focused on the theory, because as I predicted, battles have been tweaked slightly just before release. Now, the fundamentals are still the same, so the tutorial is still in vogue, but I do want to point out a couple of changes that have been made before we get into the meat of it. The main thing to note is that this hourly multiplier has been changed to 0.2 versus the 0.5 that you'll see on the other screen. This means that battles will be a lot slower than they were previously, and levies have been nerfed. They have a minus 10% to their overall discipline over here, as well as a minus 10% to their total damage output. They are still better than professional troops at the start of the game, given this base damage from 1,000 men. I'll get more into the exact numbers in this tutorial, but it is important for you to keep in mind, especially at the start of the game and early mid-game, levies will be better than your professional troops, unit for unit. Not man for man, unit for unit. But you can see that the dice roll here is 1, which means there is a base damage of 0.2. Promise not to go into numbers, but I know people care. For each dice roll, that number goes up by 0.04. So for example, if we rolled a 2, then it would be 0.24. At that point, your various modifiers are added. For example, your discipline, whether or not you're flanking, how good you are. And here's that military tactics. They have a military tactics of 2.01, and so the damage that they receive is reduced by 50.24%. There's a lot. Again, I'm going to try and not dive too much into numbers, but you got to trust me, when OBB and I sat down, we trawled over this for hours, so I'm real deep in the source when it comes to this. But essentially, the higher your military tactics, the less damage that you're going to take. Even though they're levies, they're still going to take 50% damage. At that point, it's expressed as a fraction of 1,000. Now, what does that mean? So in EU5, a base unit In EU5, 1,000 troops is considered base, which means if you have lower than 1,000 troops, let's say you have 500, damage is going to reduce by 50%. If you have 2,000 troops in a regiment, then damage is going to be doubled. So later on, when you have single regiments that have 3,000, they're going to do 3 times the amount of damage. Given this is the start of the game and we're looking at the levies, you can see that the total damage from these 940 men are 0.09. Then after all that's been calculated, so again, imagine that damage is coming at 0.09, that's when things like strength damage done and unique modifiers are added. So that is what's causing the damage to this lot. And that is also happening to me at the same time, and so on and so forth. So you'll get the sense that over time, men fight, men die, and some men will flee the battle. But what's happening over here? Well, no one is taking the field just yet. They haven't been lucky enough, which means that these guys aren't engaged. They're actually doing 200% morale damage because they're not being engaged. So they basically get freebies. They get to attack this back line without taking any casualties. And now we've gone forward a tick. Someone has joined the battle, and so now everything is going to be focused on this guy here. But still, on our right flank, no one is engaged. They still haven't gotten lucky enough yet. But over time, as I let it play out for a couple of ticks, you can start to see more and more troops joining the battle. And now you can see that I can't actually bring any more troops in because the frontage is full. We'll go into specifically how we can utilize this in a second. But that, in a nutshell, is generally how battles will work. We'll start to see our casualties go up here, as well as how many men are retreating. And so over time, we break one of these flanks. Now, this is the other thing I need to discuss. You start to see that these guys don't have anyone in front of them. So if there's no one in front of them, they'll attack this, this section here, the right flank, but not on the front line. If no one is there, then they will start to flank. Flanking is really, really good because it means that these guys are attacking this lot, as well as these guys attacking these individuals here. And some troops, for example, cavalry, get a bonus to flanking. So this unit here does 200% flanking damage. So when it's engaging an enemy that's not on its front, it does 200% damage. So you can start to see how maybe you want to overstack one flank with full cavalry to destroy the opposing flank and then go in. So this center could be weaker, but because it's getting flanked, we will do way, way more damage, particularly if it's cavalry. And once a unit starts to flank, you'll see quite quickly it will collapse. It's taking damage from multiple sources, and the bonus here is that these guys aren't actually being engaged, so they don't take any strength or morale damage, and the battle is won. At the end, we'll get to see our casualties that we've dealt and received. We've dealt massive 8,000 casualty, and we've received 2,000. You can see up here when we select the war screen how much value that was. From one battle, that was 25 war score. Now, this will actually give us a ticking war score because the war goal for the no casus belli, is show superiority, which means winning enough battles. So we're going to get this ticking war score. You get ticking war score up to 25. So if I were to sit back and not engage Portugal to not engage me, then we would get a total war score of 50%. So that's your basic battles there. Now, a couple of things to note is, bear in mind that scaling of 1,000. At the start of the game, our regular troop units have 100 men, which means that even though they're professionals, they will be scaled down to just 10% of the damage. So at the start of the game, levies are king, and this is something that will continue on into the early mid-game because they have a base size of 1,000. Doesn't mean that all of them have 1,000. If I scroll down here, for example, 722, this might not be because they took casualties, but because they were raised in an area that just doesn't have that kind of population to support that many levies. However, in more populous areas where they have 1,000 troops, that means they're doing, at the start of the battle at least, 100% damage versus the professional troops 10%. Later on, professional troops will scale to 3,000 per regiment, and then you'll see them do 3 times the amount of damage that levies would do, and they would have high base stats as well. So those are battles, but what about wars in general? Well, at the top here, you can see that we have food capacity when it comes to these troops. It'll also tell you where food is coming from. So if I were to dive into this fort here, you can see that my food source is still coming from this province, and I'm fairly secure in it, so I'm not going to have any problems. If I were to strike deep into enemy territories without a clear line behind me, that is when I'm going to be suffering the consumption of food. And you can see here, I have 2 month capacity in this army here, which means I will run out in 2 months' time. We'll get into the Navy fully in a sec, but for now, I need to show you that you can do this. You could distribute food and gather food from nearby ports for your navy, which means that if I'm sitting on this port here, you can see that I'm starting to suffer that food shortage that I told you about, and I'll have to rely on my navy to supply me. Also, I can just take the territory, and that will sort me out as well. This is now my food source. So if I'm going to go over here and try and take this territory, this is going to be my food source. And you can see the same thing goes to my navy. My navy is starting to run out of food as well, because I'm quite far away from any of my ports. Another thing to note is hidden territory. So different topography have different vision stats, I think the best way you can call it. So for example, I'm standing in this province, and because this is a plains province over here, I can see it. If there was an enemy army standing here, I would be fine. So marching into this territory over here, I can't actually see what's around me. Now, I have placed the Portuguese army in this province, but you wouldn't be able to tell. So if I march in, I'm not going to know until battle is joined that there's even an army there. See? There you go. So you can see, if I select my army, where these sorts of places are. This also means you can lay traps, particularly for the AI, because, for example, if I've taken this fort here, I know the AI wants to take it, but if I stand right here, he won't know I'm there. The AI cannot see you either. So it's just good to note that if I'm marching in, there could be an army of 50,000 men here, and I just wouldn't know. So things like fog of war and hidden troops are very, very important, because a lot of new players will not understand. Oh, well, where was that army? Yeah, they were hidden. It's a little tricky. Now let's have a look at a siege. So here is how sieges work. We have siege phases. So in this case, they are 21 days. The base is 30 and they're impacted by these different modifiers. If, for example, Portugal had ridiculously high fort defense, then these siege phases would last longer, which means the siege is going to last longer. Each siege phase, a dice is rolled. It's from 1 to 14. So basically you score from anywhere from 1 to 14. We've scored 9 in this case. The modifiers are added together. In this case, it's 9 plus 4 because of the siege accumulation, how long we've been sieging, minus 2 because of the level of fortification that we're sieging, and then we have the artillery impact and the breaches. If, for example, I add a full stack of artillery here, then it would give me plus 5 to the siege. So for very well-defended forts, especially in places like the mountains, you're going to need artillery to make any sort of headway, because obviously I am going to be taking attrition. Right now I have my food line secured and I'm okay, so I'm not taking too much. We can see here I have 22,576 men sieging versus their originally 187 garrison, but it went down to 152 because of the amount of troops that have been dying due to the ongoing siege. So what does rolling a dice even mean in this case? So our total bonuses are 2. We have rolled a 9, which means we get 11. That is a supplies shortage. You can see the chance of each of these things happening, and when they do, they will do different things. Status quo means nothing changes. Supply shortage, 2% of the garrison loses their strength. Food shortage, 3% lose their strength. Water shortage, 5% loses their strength. And if we get a defender's desert, 10% of them lose their strength. For right now, we have a minus 21% chance of that happening. So surrender is impossible happening on the next siege phase. But if we go speed 5 for a little bit, you'll start to see, there we go, supply shortage, more in the desert. We see a food shortage, more in the desert. And now we'll see there's a 7% chance that they surrender. Because of the siege accumulation, it means that it's more likely we're going to be getting this surrender. So 7% chance, a 14% chance. And we're waiting to roll 20 or above. And there we go, we actually do. And that means that we get the fort. And you'll see this start to change. So provinces in Europa Universalis 5 have zones of control. So this fort is exerting a zone of control over here, which means this province is going to flip to me, including this one here. That also means if I don't control the province that is exerting the control, for example up here, if I march away, then this is now going to flip back to him, like that. This doesn't necessarily have to be a fort either, especially with smaller nations. You'll have provinces like this that will exert control over these two, but there's no fort here, so taking it, you can do that with just a couple hundred men. So sometimes there can be a bit of cat and mouse here, especially if, for example, I leave this fort, and Portugal, who I didn't even know they were there, they were hidden, march over here and attempt to start to siege it back. Now, over here, we only have 10 defenders, which means it's a good idea of ordering an assault, which means our men are just going to rush the town instead of trying to wait it out. This is incredibly painful without a breach, but in this case, there's only 10 defenders, so we can go over here and order an assault. And that means that our troops are now going to try and do that. There you go, they've killed 5, and there are no defenders left, which means we get it back immediately. And obviously, it starts off with only 10 men in the garrison as well. Early game, this will be a lot of flipping between the two, but what I can do is with my professional troops, I can enable this refilling garrison. What that will do is it will send the men of this fort in to act as the garrison. Levies can't do this. So in this case, we are going to assault this fort back, and we're going to send in our professional troops. And that means now we can refill the garrison. We can also click this, which will auto-refill it. So we're going to refill here. There we go. You can see that 0 men belong to this army now, and the rest have all gone into this fort. So now into strategies. How can I, in this case, as Portugal, win? You can't really, especially after losing a big battle like Portugal did. They really don't have the ability to replenish themselves. Levies will not replenish until sent home and re-raised. So losses are damn near permanent, and professional troops, you're going to need to pull on your manpower pool. So only take battles that you are fairly certain you're going to win. As Portugal, it's probably better to go for hit and run tactics and do things like hiding over here in terms of the blocked vision. Paying attention to the frontage is also very important. So if you're a smaller army, you want as little frontage as possible. If you're a larger army, you want wide open plains. Now that initiative side of things is very, very important. England, for example, are a little bit special. They have these warbow levies, which have 5 initiative. One thing that's quite nice is that at a glance, you can see how much better or worse your troops are than the average. For example, warbows have +4 initiative compared to the Age of Traditions infantry. That means that when we're fighting the French, our boys take to the field a lot quicker, and they can hold those flanks. It doesn't matter. Think Napoleon defeat in detail. It doesn't matter if your opponent outnumbers you 5-1 if on the field of battle you're always attacking him 3-1. So these high initiative troops can run in, take the field, and start dealing that kind of damage. The problem is, generally speaking, the trade-off is they'll be quite weak. Archers over here, for example, have 6 initiative, but they do less strength damage done and morale damage done. But the inverse is also true. If I have low initiative troops that are stronger, if they're able to tank the initial hits, and over here, you can start to see how I might do that. This Levy has started to get experience. He's got 2% experience because of that one or 2 battles he's done, which reduces damage in combat, which means he'll stay in combat for longer. So if I have a larger army that's fighting a high initiative army, every tick, there's more of a chance of my guys getting in. So if I have a core of troops that are high experience because they're professional and they take little damage, high initiative is going to do very little to them because they can hold the field until reinforcements arrive, at which point your front lines have numbers in your favor. But it's entirely up to you. Like, the one thing I do like about Europa Universalis 5 combat is that you can start to design your armies how you like to do that. For example, I can change my formation and put all of my cavalry on one flank. I can strengthen one flank over here, allow this one to have a lower frontage so it just barely holds, smash one flank and then go through. It also depends on your opponent. One of my first games was as the Ottomans, and I went up against the Horsemen of the East, and I was absolutely destroyed because I hadn't taken into account the fact that they had really high initiative cavalry that were then really good at flanking. Okay, let's talk about the Navy. Similar to the Army, navies can be raised as levies, they can also be hired as mercenaries, they can also be built as ships. Now, it's important to note that a galley will absolutely destroy a cog in battle. Later on, you'll unlock things like light ships, which are more trade-based, and heavy ships, obviously more combat-based. But at the start of the game, a professional traditional galley will just destroy a transport fleet. Building galleys and cogs like this are the same as normal land troops, but you're going to use your sailors instead. Similarly, if you want to find out how to get sailors, go over here, monthly sailors, and these things will give it to you. Fishing villages can be built in rural areas. In terms of your Navy statistics, it's a similar looking screen to the Army, and frankly, these do mostly the same things. I will point out that naval damage is split into sources of damage increase and damage reduction. Then we have the individual power of the different ships, as well as our naval range over here. This is specifically how far our ships can go before they'll need to come back to resupply. One other thing is we have a blockade capacity down here, and like armies, you can get these guys to perform automated actions. The military objective you're going to use the most is patrol the seas. It's most useful in peacetime, and you'll learn more about it in my economic tutorial because it's going to increase your maritime presence. Well, France declared war on me. Okay, thanks, France. I was just trying to show this off. Okay, so there are 54 ships here, right? So I've tagged in as Flanders, and I'll show you. I mean, I didn't even get a chance to show you. That's how quick it is. All right, instead I've gone back to Portugal and Castile. A battle is going to be joined here, and you'll see that the battles themselves look very much like the land battles that I've already showed off. We have a reserve, we have different flanks, and then we have our combat. And battle is going to join in much the same way with the different dice rolls. And as always, when we get flanked, the battle is over. In terms of my recommendations as to who to play so you can figure out war, I would recommend England or France if you are bold enough to get to grips with the military system in terms of large amounts of levies and generally fighting each other. You will probably lose that if you are France. And if you're playing as England and you're not careful, you can get swamped due to vassals. But it's a good way of learning the game for sure. On the flip side, the Teutonic Order starts at war with the Duchy of Lithuania. They have a slightly different situation. As they are a military order, they actually can rely a bit more on professional troops. They have 7,300 manpower at the start. And so you can start to test out some strategies using those professional troops. Otherwise, for pure expansionism, the Ottomans are a great pick. But in order, Castile first, so you can fight, for example, Portugal to understand how battles work and how the different buttons are. England to fight with levies, and the Teutonic Order to fight with professional soldiers. Let's take a look at advances and technology in Europa Universalis 5. So first things first, I'm going to take you through things on this screen and what they mean at a glance. The first thing to note is we are in the age of traditions. EU5 is split into 6 different ages. I'll go through each age in turn. You can see the end date of each age down here. So for example, the Age of Traditions is going to end May 1342. Over here, Age of Renaissance, January 1437, and then it's every 200 years after that. On the left-hand side of the screen here, we can see each institution in this age. I'll go through what institutions are and how they spread in a bit. Over here, we can see our monthly research progress, our average literacy, and the market prices. Down here, we can see all of the advances that we can research. Right now, we can only research organized religion. I can left click, and it will add it to the queue. That will then unlock us being able to queue other technologies. That's because if I click here, you'll see that this is in fact a research tech tree. There's a lot of different advancements here. We start with a lot of them in the Age of Traditions already unlocked, but the one I've selected over here is organized religion. Once we research that, we'll unlock the ability described underneath it, in this case 50 possible clerics in towns and cities, as well as some max literacy for clergy, and it'll unlock down here. If I wanted to, for example, focus on the stability investment over here from Devotion to the Virgin Mary, I'm going to click OK there. And then after we've done that, we are going to go and research over here. I add that to the queue and it will research them all in time. If I want to remove something from the tree, I would right click and remove it. Obviously, removing a tech at the base of the tree is going to remove the previous ones. A lot of the uniqueness from different nations in Europa Universalis 5 comes from the technology tree. For example, over here, Universal Christianity, you can see is a special advance because we are Christian. Special advances are denoted through a little icon here. For example, we are a monarchy, therefore we have access to these ones. This is true for the future. For example, in the Age of Renaissance, we can grab these two because we are also Christian, or specifically Catholic. Then there are specific ones to do with nations. For example, we have, because we're playing as France, we can have Northern Mannerism or Reliance on Privateers. Then there's also culture group based one. For example, over here, our primary culture as the Ottomans is Turkish. Any of these primary cultures and we would have access to nomadic legacy. So depending on what nation you're playing, what culture group you're part of, what religion you're following, and what government type you have, that will determine what kinds of techs you will have already researched at the start of the game, as well as researching going forwards. For example, fratricide if you're the Ottomans. If I were to not do any research, then my research points will accrue until we get this pop-up, which is reaching research capacity. So we can have 16.42 points of stored research. Any more than that, and it's then going to waste. That means that with organized religion, once I select it, all of those research points will automatically be applied here. I'll go through base amounts and how that works in a bit, but generally speaking, you always want to be researching something. There's no reason to not. Now, if I click on the ages side of things, as I mentioned earlier, some advances need to be unlocked via institutions. Over here, meritocracy, we don't have the relevant institution to be able to select it. There are 3 institutions per age, and once at least 20% of your populace has been exposed to the institution, you can accept it. The cost of embracing this institution is going to be impacted by a couple of factors. At base, the higher percentage present in your country, the cheaper it's going to be. And then it's impacted by the cost of paper in this case, as well as the fact that we are mildly innovative. There is even an institutions map mode that I can show you here. For example, see this province right here? It has all 3 advances, whereas over here, for example, they only have feudalism. This means that when an age begins and an institution is spawned in, you're going to be locked out of those trees until you manage to get hold of them. So how do we get hold of them? Well, institutions will spread over time. So over here, we can see that meritocracy originated in Carmichael, which means it's already over in China. So if we switch over to the Great Yuan, you can see that they already have all 3 institutions. Whereas, for example, I cannot pronounce that, Muangluan already has feudalism and legalism, and meritocracy is slowly making its way there. How quick this spread is depends on a multitude of factors. The most important of which are, is the institution present next door? If it is, it's going to be super easy for you to get it in your province. Then things like the satisfaction and development of the location itself, and then it's hampered by the physical size of the location. But it's not just physical proximity that will help with this. For example, if I am the Khmer Empire, facilitating trades with markets that have this present will mean that Angkor, our market center, will start to get exposed to those institutions. So you can see that because we're importing goods from locations with meritocracy from it, and specifically I'm importing pepper from the Guangzhou province in South China, it started this process. Obviously, June 1748 isn't ideal. That's because it's just a singular trade route right now. But that is how to get institutions into your country a little bit faster than just waiting for them to get across to you. And now it's the dawn of the age of the Renaissance. At the start of every single age, you'll have a choice between an administrative focus, a diplomatic focus, and a military focus. This is a one-time choice for the next 100 years. What it does is it unlocks these technologies for you. So it's worth having a look through and seeing if there's anything that is super necessary. That doesn't mean that if you've gone military focus, you are going to suddenly win every single battle, or if you've gone admin focus, that you are never going to be able to have a colonization focus. It's just a gentle skewing because it does unlock a couple of handy little things. For example, the religious war casus belli in this administrative focus selection, or claim fabrication over here in diplomacy. So if I'm going to go on the admin side of things, then in the Age of Renaissance, all the way down here, for example, is the possibility of unlocking the religious war. So that is how to unlock the possibility of researching technologies. How about researching them themselves? Well, over here you can see that every tech has a base cost of 25 technology points. We have a monthly research progress of 1.36 here. So every month we'll put that 1.36 monthly research into a technology, and once we hit the required technology points, in this case 25, the technology will be researched. It's worth noting that in each age, the technologies get progressively more expensive by 15%. So over here in the Age of Revolutions, the Enlightenment, for example, will cost the base 25 multiplied by an additional 75%. However, if we progress into the Age of Renaissance, the previous technology era will have -8 to the base. So it's only going to cost us 17 research points at base versus 25 to research previous technologies. The idea is as you progress through the ages, technologies are a little bit trickier to research to compensate for the fact that you'll probably have a lot more monthly research progress, whereas researching from a previous era will be a lot easier. Okay, so what goes into your monthly research progress? As a settled country, we have a base of 1.00. It's important to distinguish between base monthly research progress and percentages. So here are base numbers, so 1.07, and then they're multiplied by these percentages. So here it says the power of our liturgical language, I'll get to that very, very shortly, gives us 0.07. Then our average literacy of 10.48, the number of embraced institutions, and then our clergy estate satisfaction. So the happier our clergy are, and the higher our literacy, the faster we are going to be researching. Now let's focus on this power of the liturgical language real quick. That is the language that is used in our main religion. For us, our liturgical language is Latin. This has a language power of 37.64%. How's that determined? Well, it's expressed as a percentage of the strongest language power. So in this case, Mandarin represents the strongest power. We have a score of 47,000 odd, and so our language power is 37% roughly of that. As you see here, for every 1,000 clerics of the primary religion, where the liturgical language is used gives 20. I wouldn't think about this too hard. Getting to the numbers doesn't really give you too much benefit, but generally speaking, the stronger your liturgical language, the faster your research. For example, if we flip over to the Mamluks to check out their liturgical language, it is going to be Arabic. And that is a slightly weaker language in terms of language power. And so it sits at around 26%. And I believe, if my maths is right, that's going to give them around 0.05. Yes, okay, good. So this scales up to a 0.2 bonus. So essentially, if the language that you use is very powerful, you get a bonus to your research progress. You might think that this would make the Great Yuan ridiculously powerful in terms of their language, but unfortunately for them, their liturgical language is Tibetan. And even if they flip over to their religion being Sanjiao, that is classical Chinese, not Mandarin. And so it's an even weaker liturgical language. Some religions allow you to change your liturgical language, some do not. But let's focus on things that are easier to control. Welcome to the Kingdom of France, but this time in the year 1807. And now we can see that our monthly research progress is a lot higher. We still have the same settled country, the liturgical language is a lot more powerful, but the key part here is that our average literacy is much higher, and we have a lot more institutions embraced. And you can see here that the base research progress needed is 25. It's minused by 8 because of a previous age, and because an age of absolutism advance, it goes to 60% increase. So that scales from 15% to 70% in 15% jumps, depending on the age that you look at. Technology can be a little bit daunting to look at in terms of the tech trees and the research tab and the ages and the institutions, but my advice is to look in advance as to what you kind of want to see. For example, if I was in the age of traditions here, I'd look and go, well, I want archers. Or if I'm English and I want the war bows in the age of Renaissance, okay, well, that's something I need. Or if I'm French and I want this army morale, then I go, okay, well, Elan, I need that. And then it'll queue it up and you can go about your day. If you want to really literacy and institution max, then making sure your clergy is loyal, making sure you have high literacy is very important. How do you get high literacy? There are buildings like libraries that you can build that will increase that, and it will also help things like your institution growth. So a combination of technologies and buildings will allow your max literacy to increase, but bear in mind that with literacy, your pops become more aware. As the tooltip says, generally speaking, literacy is good, but it will increase the impact of the market price on the needs of the pop satisfaction. What that means is if a pop finds a good to be too expensive, then it's going to be even more upset about it because it can read the prices. So a well-educated populace is a little harder to please. And there we have it. You have officially graduated. Hopefully at this point you feel like you have a firm grasp of how to play the game. From here, I would say the best way to learn is to experience it for yourself. Of course, if things still elude you, then feel free to join my Discord. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have there. And once again, chaps, if you have already purchased EU5, make sure to like them and subscribe. If you haven't, then use my code down below in the comment. I hope this helped you, and I hope you enjoy Europa Universalis 5. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.